Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Allan Little. Genocide is often called the ultimate crime, and after every tragedy, the world says it must never happen again. And yet it does. My guest today is a leading international human rights lawyer, Payam Akhavan, who made his name trying to bring justice to those responsible for war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. He believes that the international community has a duty to challenge human rights abuses wherever they occur. But is true justice ever really possible? Or is it compromised by political constraints and realities? Payam Akhavan, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for having me.
You're one of the architects of a system of international justice that's still very patchy, still quite flawed in many ways. Your encounter with Slobodan Milosevic, for instance, you said, when I brushed shoulders with him, I saw him as the personification of evil. I thought he'd never be brought to justice. You seem to bring a peculiarly intense personal mission, sense of personal mission to your work. Where does that come from? Is it your experience as an exiled Iranian?
Well, my family belonged to the Baha'i community in Iran, which has been traditionally the scapegoat, faced violent persecution for many years. And I would say the execution of my uncle in the summer of 1981, when I was still a child, solely because of his religious beliefs as a Baha'i, left a very deep impression on me. So I think personal experiences profoundly shape the way we look at the world, and they make us realize that there is a broader universal meaning to those personal experiences, and I would say those intimate encounters with suffering clearly opened my mind to the search for justice. And the worst thing is the feeling of helplessness as a victim when you are in exile and a loved one has just been tortured to death, and you have the sense that there is no way that you can achieve any form of justice. And that is the beginning of a journey very often where you begin to understand that justice is a much more profound long-term struggle than we imagine it to be.
So in a sense, you're pursuing some of your own personal demons through these international courts.
I think those personal experiences make us understand in a profound way why justice is important. We can't reduce human rights to an intellectual abstraction. What really motivates us to achieve justice against overwhelming odds is that passion, that sense of indignation. And I believe that once I experienced this in my own personal life, it opened me to understanding how someone in the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda or wherever else may feel if someone that they loved has been taken away from them through violence.
You helped set up something called the Iran Tribunal, which sat in The Hague in October 2012 to hear allegations of crimes committed in Iran in the decade after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. But it had no legal standing, did it? It wasn't set up by any properly constituted authority. What was the point of it?
This can best be described as a truth commission in exile. The mothers who lost their children, who have an organization called the Mothers of Khavaran being a notorious mass grave outside of Tehran, came to me and said, well, you're the professor of law, you're the former UN prosecutor, can you do justice for us? And it was a very humbling moment because I told them that there is no court that they could bring their case to. And that's when we decided that we should set up our own court, which has all the trappings of a properly constituted court, 100 witnesses, evidence, a panel of prominent judges, including the former head of the South African Constitutional Court, and to begin the process of accountability and political transformation in Iran by exposing the historical truth through a credible judicial process.
Did it have any effect in Iran itself?
I would say the effect was remarkable because we broadcast the testimony of the victims through satellite television, through the internet. And as you know, Iranians are very internet savvy. They're glued to satellite television. We estimate that maybe 20 million people in Iran, for the first time ever, realized that in that first decade of the revolution, tens of thousands of people were executed simply because of their beliefs. And it forced the regime, after almost 30 years of denial, to admit that these crimes had indeed occurred. There was even a remarkable propaganda piece which suggested that the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei had tried to save as many political prisoners as he could. So now they have to try and position him as a human rights champion, which shows that once human rights and accountability becomes part of the public discourse, leaders, no matter how powerful, become answerable.
But it had no legal standing. It wasn't a properly constituted judicial process. And so you're open to the charge, aren't you, that the witnesses selected themselves because there is a clear nexus here between the political imperative and the pursuit of justice. And that's something that's dogged the international courts, isn't it? That intermingling, that grey area between what's judicial and what's political.
Of course. In this case, the Iran tribunal had no formal legal standing, but it had legitimacy. And sometimes legitimacy, when we're talking about the historical truth and shaping public opinion, is more important than legal, formal sort of status. But there is always a delicate balance between law and politics. But at the end of the day, the legal process is about ascertaining the truth through objective evidence, through witness testimony, through corroboration. It is a much more focused and rigorous way of understanding phenomena than, let's say, a discussion about history or politics or what have you.
I mean, there's a leftist group called Rahe Karga which criticised the tribunal. It said that they felt some victims were excluded. They questioned the transparency of the process. They want to know who funded it and so on. Mm-hmm. You are open to the charge that it was a highly politicised thing. You've muddied the waters between what's judicial and what's political.
Well, there were 100 witnesses in a tribunal which was basically set up by the victims themselves and funded by them, which is a remarkable feat of sort of survivors and victims becoming activists and putting together a truth commission in exile, which I think is unprecedented. But when you have tens of thousands of victims, by some estimates the number of executions are as high as 40 to 50,000, according to Professor Ervand Abrahamyan. So you are all necessarily going to be selective in terms of only being able to represent a slice of the truth, but
and
nonetheless,
it's clear that you can't bring anybody justice, really, can you? You can't. This wasn't a tribunal that promised justice.
Depends on what you mean by justice. Justice isn't just putting a defendant in the dock. And remember what Hannah Arendt said about the Nuremberg judgment. She said it explodes the limits of the law. How can you ever bring anyone to justice for crimes on that scale? But at the very least, by exposing the truth, by giving the victims a catharsis, that in itself is a first step towards achieving justice. And when you're dealing with mass crimes, I think transforming public values, exposing people to the truth itself sometimes is more important than putting this or that person in prison.
Are the Western democracies, do you think, right to pursue sanctions against Iran because of the nuclear program, or will it simply strengthen the regime as it exists?
I have said for at least a decade that it is a mistake to focus exclusively on the nuclear issue. The problem in Iran is not potential nuclear capability, it's the nature of the regime. It's the regime that makes the potential of nuclear capability a threat. So until Iran is democratized, until there's the rule of law and respect for human rights, Iran will continue to be a threat to Western interests. And of course, Western governments are not necessarily interested in what is best for the Iranian people. They're looking at their own interests. But let's look at the example of the military dictatorships in Brazil and Argentina that were both pursuing nuclear programs which they gave up under civilian rule. And let's look at South Africa under apartheid, the same thing. So the point is that a regime that doesn't have democratic legitimacy will by nature become militarized.
But can the West afford to wait for a democratizing process in Iran?
I'm not sure what choice there is. The choices seem to be a military confrontation, which is an appalling choice, given what we've seen in the Middle East. And the other choice is appeasement through striking some sort of grand bargain with Iran. And I think that the middle path has to be the empowerment of a civil society and conditioning international acceptance on respect for human rights. Policymakers tend to see human rights as a soft issue for a group of naive activists. Well, I think that human rights is at the core of any viable long-term solution to the problem of Iran in the Middle East.
But civil society is very strong in Iran. It's just not as strong as the regime.
Well, certainly, civil society has been many years in the making in Iran. Ironically, thanks to a totalitarian state, Iran has the most vigorous and the most secular civil society in the Middle East. And we saw in 2009, at least a year before the so-called Arab Spring, that the first place in which civil society really succeeded, at least in shaking the pillars of power, was in Iran. And I can tell you that for many years, when we were talking about civil society, decision makers in Washington and London were mocking at us and saying that it's impossible to have the kind of velvet revolutions we witnessed in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere in the Islamic Middle East, because people just have to understand the complexities of an entire region that's going through historical transition from tradition to modernity, from authoritarianism to democracy. That transition is going to be complex, it's going to be messy in places, but I believe that Iran is the furthest advanced in the Middle East, and just beneath the surface of this tyrannical regime is a youthful generation which is post-utopian, post-ideological, and Iran has the potential of transforming the entire region.
And does the new president, Mr. Rouhani, represent change?
Well, there is some hope that the regime, for its own survival, has to bring about certain reforms. I remain skeptical. One of the members of the cabinet of Mr. Rouhani, one of the proposed members, is a man by the name of Mr. Pur Mohammadi, who was a member of the death commission that in the 1980s executed tens of thousands of people. That, I don't think, is sending the right message to the international community and to the people of Iran. But the point is that Iran cannot be ruled indefinitely through terror and torture and intimidation. And at some point, the regime will have to accommodate the demands of people for greater openness and accountability.
Let me ask you about how you started in this human rights business. You joined the prosecutor's office at the War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia as a very young man. Why did it have such a big impact on you?
From a personal point of view, once again, I think it goes back maybe to those childhood experiences that open you to understanding human suffering and injustice. And in Bosnia, during the first week of my employment with the United Nations, I was deployed in the village of Ahmici, in which several hundred civilians, including women and children, had been brutally massacred. And that was a rather rude awakening at the beginning of my career as an international lawyer. And once again, it was a very intimate encounter with what human rights really mean.
And it was a very long time ago, 20 years, and those trials are still taking place. In Bosnia, it's often said that justice delayed is justice denied. Why has it all taken so long?
Well, what's interesting is that we had the Nuremberg model of justice, which is an army which sits victorious atop the vanquished enemy, and the Allied powers could simply march down the streets of Berlin and arrest the entire Nazi leadership. That wasn't the case in the former Yugoslavia. The former Yugoslavia was a situation in which there was a tribunal set up together with appeasement of those responsible for ethnic cleansing. So it's a bit like having Nuremberg after accepting Hitler's annexation of the Eastern Territories.
And one of the things it was meant to do is promote reconciliation. In fact, all the evidence is it's done the opposite. All sides in that war have carefully selected the parts of the evidence that they want to believe, that they believe consistent with their own adopted narrative. It's had the opposite effect. It hasn't promoted reconciliation. It's further entrenched division, hasn't it?
Well, I would begin by saying that justice isn't necessarily about reconciliation. Reconciliation is an incidental byproduct of criminal justice. But we also have to realize that even in post-war Germany, it took at least 1 or 2 generations before the lessons of Nuremberg were learned. There was still great sympathy for the Nazis well past the Nuremberg judgment. But I think it's a mistake to think that we're going to achieve reconciliation simply by prosecuting people from all sides in a conflict.
But it's what we were promised when the court was set up, that it would be an instrument of reconciliation. And it failed in that respect, at least, didn't it?
I wouldn't say it failed. I would say that we have to imagine what the world would look like if Slobodan Milosevic was still in power, if Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were not held accountable in The Hague and were still in positions of power. Although there are still very serious tensions, the removal of those warmongers and what we call, the ethnic entrepreneurs that instrumentalize hatred to achieve power. The removal from the political stage, I think, has made peace and stability much more viable in the former Yugoslavia. This doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to embrace each other in some sort of shared humanity, but it does help create a context.
You'll remember Sir Geoffrey Nice, who led the prosecution against Slobodan Milosevic. He said that many of the judges were simply not up to the job. They were often dumped on the tribunal from parts of the world where they weren't properly qualified. Initially, he said, I was very much a believer. Here, for the first time since Nuremberg, was international justice. Then I became cynical. I saw that the judges very often didn't know what was happening and the trials were being ruined. He also said that the judges were under pressure to be ethnically even-handed. We've convicted a Serb, we'd better convict a Croat and a Muslim as well to balance it. Did you become disillusioned in any sense?
There is a sort of romance with any kind of undertaking which is unprecedented. And in 1993, when the Yugoslav tribunal was set up, we didn't have any other tribunal to look back at. And once you see the daily reality of what it means to organize a trial and a prosecution, you begin to move towards a kind of a post-romantic phase. So could there be improvements in the tribunal? Absolutely. The quality of judges, the quality of the prosecution. I think many mistakes were made, including the idea that we can achieve justice by indicting people from all sides, this sort of moral parity theory. And we see what the legacy of that has been. Under the tenure of the former prosecutor, Carlo Del Ponte, 10 senior non-Serbs were indicted, and there were 9 acquittals. 9 out of 10 were acquitted.
Well, since we're talking about that, let me ask you about the time you crossed the floor from the prosecutor's office to the defence, to a defence job. You defended General Ante Gotovina from Croatia. This is a man who was charged with war crimes committed in 1995 against Serbs living in Croatia. Tens of thousands of Serbs fled their homes in the process of the operation that he led. He evaded justice. He went on the run for 4 years, and yet you came to his defence. Didn't you have any doubts about that?
I was asked to join the team. I looked at the evidence. I came to the conclusion that he was innocent, and that premonition was vindicated recently when the appeals chamber of the tribunal acquitted him of all charges. And what's important to bear in mind is that Operation Storm in August of 1995 occurred after the Srebrenica genocide in 1995, after the United Nations for 3 years failed miserably to protect the victims of ethnic cleansing. The Croats and Muslims decided that they have to take matters into their own hands. But what's even more important is that the artillery attack, which allowed Croatia to reclaim the Krajina territory, was investigated by 2 separate United Nations missions, which both concluded that no war crimes had been committed.
But this is not a narrative that goes down in Serbia. In Serbia, they perceived that the release of General Gotovina is absolute proof that this tribunal is loaded against the Serbs.
Yes, except that 3 senior Serbs have also been acquitted. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of criticism leveled against the judges, in particular the president, Theodore Meron, all sorts of conspiracy theories about these acquittals. At the end of the day, I think the blame lies squarely at the door of the prosecutor's office. When you don't have sufficient evidence, you don't go to trial, let alone in this sort of context where these acquittals are going to create profound disillusionment. At the end of the day, the judges are not there to appease public opinion in Serbia or Croatia or Bosnia. Justice is about guilt or innocence based on objective evidence.
Somebody else you're also working with now is the son of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam. You're representing the Libyan judicial system, arguing for the right of the Libyan courts to try Saif al-Islam there in Tripoli. The Libyan novelist Hisham Matar has written that the Libyans used to be afraid of a brutal police state. They're now afraid of the absence of the state. Without an army and a police force to protect the people and guard the independence of the civil servants and elected officials, a new conflict is brewing. The state doesn't really exist in Libya. How can Saif al-Islam possibly get a fair trial from a country that is now run by independent, unaccountable militias?
Well, I'm not at liberty to discuss this case, which is pending before the International Criminal Court, but I think the basic principle, which is enshrined in the statute of the International Criminal Court, is that where national courts are able and willing to prosecute, they must be given primacy. The International Criminal Court is only there where national justice is not possible.
And national justice is surely not possible in Libya under the current circumstances.
Well, it's a question of understanding that any society that is emerging from crimes against humanity and mass atrocities is not going to have the judicial system of Sweden or Canada. It's going to be a society which needs judicial capacity building, which needs sufficient time
it's not going to come early enough for Saif al-Islam to give him a fair trial, is it?
Well, I think the question, once again, can be put in the context, for example, of Rwanda, in which, despite the fact that there was a UN tribunal for Rwanda, there were 130,000 people in prison after the 1994 genocide. And the Rwandan judicial system, which is in a far, far worse situation than Libya, was given the opportunity over time to manage these cases. And I think that they have done a relatively decent job.
Let me ask you about genocide. You've done a lot of work on this in recent days, and you've said genocide has become a trophy which bestows the crown of ultimate importance and suffering on certain people. Do you think the charge of genocide is bandied around too freely now?
I remember during the mass murder in Rwanda in 1994, the big issue was this genocide or was it not genocide? And while this debate was taking place in the United Nations, 1 million people were slaughtered in 3 months in Rwanda. And then in the case of Darfur in Sudan, the US Secretary of State Colin Powell said, well, we're not going to deny the label of genocide as the Clinton administration did with respect to Rwanda. We will call this by its rightful name.
So this is highly politicized.
But we will still not do anything. This is the problem.
It's been taken out of the judicial realm and put in the hands of political actors.
It's not only that, but we have created this illusion of progress in the United Nations, in academic circles and other elite contexts, where we think that symbolic condemnation of mass atrocities somehow represents progress, and it becomes really a substitute for more effective action. It doesn't really matter what you call the murder of 1 million people in Rwanda or Darfur. What is important is whether there's any meaningful action to protect those victims.
The QC Philip Sands, who you'll know is a great champion of international justice like you, he says these courts are a world of laws that are like spiders' webs through which the big flies pass freely and the little ones get caught. It's true, isn't it? We're not going to see American soldiers or British soldiers arraigned at the International Criminal Court. If you look at the list of indictees at the ICC, they're all African. When are we going to see a system which will hold citizens of powerful countries to scrutiny the way they do citizens of smaller countries?
I have a slightly different take on this, because I remember the complaint that people had about the Yugoslav tribunal having been established only because the victims were Europeans. Another complaint is that we're setting up all these courts and exercising jurisdiction in relation to Africa. Well, I would say good for the African people that there is an institution that is addressing the grave injustices that are being committed on that continent. But
it remains a weakness, doesn't it, that China, Russia, the United States, 3 permanent members of the Security Council, refused to sign up to the ICC.
That is clearly a weakness. And once again, we have to understand the rise of global justice as a historical process. 20 years ago, we didn't have a single jurisdiction to punish genocidal murderers. And today we have the remarkable precedent of the Yugoslav tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal, and a number of other instances where we have at least some measure of justice rather than not at all. And I must also say that it may be more fashionable to condemn the Americans for war crimes, but I think the biggest source of injustice is the failure of the United States and the Western powers to intervene in situations like Rwanda, in situations like Darfur. That, to me, is a much bigger problem for global justice.
Thank you for speaking to us on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.